morning. Today I will present a scene from a movie entitled Rush Hour. In the scene, there's issue that involve two different cultures, which are Chinese and African American people. So now let's watch the video.
Please tell me you speak English. I'm Detective Carter. Do you speak any English? Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? I cannot believe this shit. First I get a bullshit assignment, then Mr. Rice-A-Roni don't even speak American. Come on, man, right over here. Put your bag in the back. Put your bag in the back. No. You put your own shit in the back. I'm not a sky cap. I'm FBI, you understand? What the hell you think this is?
Okay, as you seen in the video, there are few conflicts, right? Yep, it is related to different culture. Intercultural communication. What is intercultural communication? Intercultural communication consists of two types of communication, which are verbal and non-verbal interaction between people from different cultural background. It can be complex due to different culture not encoding and decoding messages the same. So, I will explain about the conflict of verbal communication that occur in that scene. The conflict in that video is stereotyping that every Asian doesn't know how to speak English. But why stereotyping happens in that scene? It is because the power of effect of labels. We make preconceptions of other based only the language we have heard or used to describe them. According to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, language defines our experience. Language not only expresses ideas but also shapes ideas about perception of the world. Like Mr. Carter thought that Mr. Lee doesn't speak English because he is Asian, and for English speaker, the label Asian as someone who doesn't understand English. The idea that particular language we speak determines our perception of reality is best represented by Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Now, we move to attitude towards speaking and silence. In some cultural groups, it is important to speak, and listening is as secondary. Sometimes silence is viewed negatively. For example, silence is considered as rejection or misunderstanding. Like in the video, Mr. Carter thought Mr. Lee definitely didn't understand English because as African American, silence viewed as rejection and not understanding. In some cultural groups, they emphasize primarily on silence and harmony. It shows the ability to read another person's mind intuitively like Mr. Lee did. There are at least 3 distinctive dimensions of communication style, but in the video there are 2. The high low context and elevated understated context. High context means when doing business in high context culture, such as Asian like Mr. Lee, might encounter the following misunderstanding when exchanging information and impression of lack information, while low context, when doing business in low context culture, such as US, like Mr. Carter on the other hand, you might find the following extensive background information and explanation are provided verbal, as we can see Mr. Carter so talkative. Now for elaborate and understated. Elaborate and understated communication style refer to the quantity of thought that culture values and is related to attitudes towards speech and silence. For elaborate style of communication refer to the use of rich and excessive language in everyday conversation, like Mr. Carter, so expressive in conveying his thought. While for understated communication style, value simple understatement, simple assertion, and silence like what Mr. Lee did. Now let's move to non-verbal communication, which include paralinguistic, the study of vocal behaviors that indicate how something is said. With paralinguistic, it can reveal mood and emotion, allow one to emphasize or stress a word or idea, like Mr. Carter in the whole scene, where you can hear his frustration by his vocal. It can also create distinctive identity, like Mr. Carter as African American who tend to speak loudly, and as Chinese, like Mr. Lee, tend to speak with gentle. It also can regulate conversation with gesture, like Mr. Carter so expressive in using his body language and facial expression. There are 2 types of vocal behavior. First, vocal qualities is tone of voice, including speed, like Mr. Carter talks so fast and slowly when he wants to emphasize his sentences, like, "Do you speak English?" Next, the high level of pitch when Mr. Carter was saying his sentence showed that he was frustrated. For the second type of vocal behavior is vocalization, sound that do not have the structure of language, like vocal cues. In that scene where Mr. Carter was sighing. Let's look at the personal space, the distance around each of us between ourselves and others. The difference in the use of personal space is because of the culture group that may be identified as contact culture and non-contact culture. For the contact culture, as you can see in the scene, Mr. Carter stand too close to Mr. Lee, and he also come closer and speak louder when he emphasizing his question to Mr. Lee. This shows that Mr. Carter is from a contact culture. As for African American, standing closer to someone when they are speaking or talking is normal. Meanwhile, for Mr. Lee non-contact culture, because he is Chinese and it's normal for them to stand further apart while talking. We can see that there's a difference between Mr. Carter and Mr. Lee for the personal space. Take a look when Mr. Lee standing in front of the pilot and stewardess, he at least stand 1 meter away from them. But for Mr. Carter, he stand less than 1 meter in front of Mr. Lee. For the facial expression, we can see that Mr. Carter way more expressive than Mr. Lee. For a gesture, there are two kinds of gesture in the movie scene that portrayed, which are ambles and adductors. For ambles, gesture that have specific verbal translation, like Mr. Carter point out his mouth when he said mouth, the word mouth, he's point out. For adapters, gesture related to managing our emotions, like Mr. Carter again, when he used his hand to express his frustration. When he said, "Put your bag at the back," he used his hand for express. Chapter 6, the conflict. The conflict level occur in the scene is interpersonal conflict, occur between individuals. The conflict has happened because of intercultural conflict. When someone facing a conflict, they tend to manage it by their own way. But what are the influences of conflict management when they are facing the conflict? There are actually 6 of it, but we only focus on 2 of it in the scene. There are 2 approaches to conflict and intercultural conflict style that occur in the scene. 2 approaches to conflict. There are at least 2 primary ways that you can approach conflict. You can be either direct or indirect, and you can be either emotionally expressive or restrained. The way you approach conflict probably depends on your cultural background and the way you were raised. Let's take a look at of each 2 dimensions more closely: the emotional expressiveness and restrained conflict style. Mr. Carter, who value intense and overt display of emotion during discussion of disagreement, rely on the emotionally expressive style. Mr. Carter thinks it is better to show emotion during disagreement than to hide or suppress feelings. That is, he shows emotion through expressive non-verbal behavior and vocalization. On the other hand, Mr. Lee believes in the restrained style, thinks that disagreements are best discussed in emotionally calm manner. It is important to control and internalize one's feeling during conflict and to avoid non-verbal emotion. Like Mr. Lee, he only shows confused and smile expression. He didn't lash out or mad at Mr. Carter for being loud and may seem disrespect because of his guessing that Mr. Lee doesn't know how to speak English and understand English. These 2 approaches to conflict resolution reflects different underlying cultural values involving identity and preserving self-esteem. Now let's look at the second influence of conflict management: intercultural style, which consists of engagement style and accommodating style. For engagement style, emphasize a verbally direct and confrontational approach to dealing with conflicts, preferred by African Americans like Mr. Carter. He was openly complaining about his situation, his assignment, and also full of emotion while complaining even he was just met someone that for the first time. While accommodating style emphasize an indirect approach for dealing with conflict and more emotionally restrained manners like Mr. Lee, who just so calm, silently watching, smiling, and only used a few facial expression that confused face while listening to Mr. Carter. This style is preferred by most of the Asians. To avoid having conflicts in communication, we need to learn pragmatic. Pragmatic is one of the components of language. Pragmatic is the study of how language is actually used in particular contexts. The focus is on the specific purpose of language use. It's not enough to know the grammar and pronunciation of language. We must also know how to use the language correctly. That's all from me. Thank you.